Hi there. This is just a wee heads up that this video will be basically spoiler free. I'll only be using footage from promotional material or the opening stages of the game in question to try and avoid you getting spoiled, and although I do talk about some things that you could consider gameplay spoilers, there should be no real story spoilers in this video, so hopefully you can watch or listen without worrying about that. I'll talk about some other things after we go over the ranking, like about the lack of recent uploads and stuff like that. But for now, let's just crack on with the video. Starting off our list in 10th place is Emio, the Smiling Man. This is a Switch-exclusive visual novel / point-and-click game belonging to the Famicom Detective Club series, and it's the first game in that series for 27 years. So as far as I'm aware, you can treat this as a standalone entry if you've never played another game in the series, and still get as much as possible out of it. For a game developed and published by Nintendo, this one stands out as being cut from a different cloth, thanks to its dark subject matter and clear horror theming. The basic premise is that you're trying to unravel the mysteries behind the recent death of a teenager that echoes a spate of murders 18 years prior, where all victims were found with a creepy smiling paper bag over their head. I think this is a really nice middle ground if you like tension and light horror, but don't want a game that's gonna really scare you. It has its moments, but really this is a game that uses horror elements as a conduit for exploration of very heavy themes and ideas. Some of the stuff this game delves into, especially in its latter stages, is genuinely quite harrowing, but it's refreshing to see a Nintendo game, of all things, tackle these sorts of topics without sugarcoating it or dumbing it down. I think overall, it's a good game. It didn't stick with me quite as much as the other entries on this list, but it's probably the easiest to play and one of the more functionally accessible games on the list, so I'd really consider trying it out if you haven't already. In 9th place, we've got Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. The only other game in this series I've played was the prequel to this one, Yakuza Like a Dragon. If I was a veteran of the Yakuza games, however, I imagine this would have crept up a few places in this ranking. The game absolutely stands on its own in many ways, because at its core, it is just a wonderful JRPG that blends almost everything you could ever want. Like its predecessor, it has really great turn-based combat with a cool job system, it has an interesting story and follows a brilliant cast of characters, it gives you huge and exciting urban areas to explore, it has about 40 million minigames and side quests to get stuck into, and yet despite all of that, and the great time I had with it, it often still felt like it wasn't really for me. There were parts of this game, certain aspects of the narrative in particular, that felt like they had been made to reward people who had really sunk a lot of time and love into the series as a whole. And there's not anything wrong with that, per se. It just meant that a fair amount of the game's finer details and references went completely over my head, which did limit my investment in it. I would still really recommend the game though. It is such a good time despite that last point I made. Sometimes you just need to play something and get totally lost in it for like 80 hours, get completely absorbed into a new thing. And this could be the game for you if you need that. It's just worth knowing that you might miss a few things here and there if you're not already a Yakuza expert. At number 8, we have Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail. I know this is an expansion rather than an actual new game, but it's my list, so my rules. If things had gone how I had hoped, this would have been a lot higher in this ranking. Final Fantasy XIV as a whole is in my top 5 games of all time. I have played it for thousands of hours. It is my most played game this year by a distance, and has been for a fair few years now. If that's the case though, why is the new expansion in 8th place? The basics are that, on a personal level, I was left very disappointed by the story and characters, which I would normally consider the game's biggest strength. Final Fantasy XIV is, of course, in a transitional period, starting a new story after the last expansion, Endwalker, wrapped up a decade-long saga. So I have some sympathy there. It's not easy to do something new in a game like this, but narratively, it's hard not to compare Dawn Trail to the more recent expansions, like Shadowbringers and Endwalker, because this is, in my opinion at least, a noticeable step down in quality. I can't really go into detail here about what let me down, given the video is mostly spoiler-free, and I don't want this to be the longest segment of the 10, but it is worth saying that despite feeling let down by certain elements of the storytelling and some of the structural issues plaguing parts of the overall design of the game, I was a huge fan of some other elements. As always, Soken did a really good job with the music, and a few of the new areas are brilliant. One in particular is a potential all-time favourite of mine. Feel free to guess which one I'm talking about in the comments if you want. But where this expansion has really shone, for me at least, is the battle content. The new extreme and savage difficulty content we've had so far has been really fun. Dungeon bosses have added a bit more challenge than the last few expansions, and I've enjoyed a lot of the job reworks as well. But that being said, even though I love the overarching story of Final Fantasy XIV so much, and I still love the game, I felt pretty gutted back in July about how this one went, so I don't think I can put it higher than number 8. Number 7 on our list is Thank Goodness You're Here. This is a fantastic game, in which you're just a wee guy making your way around a brilliant, hand-drawn, fictionalized Yorkshire town, and you help people run errands and solve problems. For anyone watching this who is not from the UK, Yorkshire is an area in the north of England, and often people from there have a really strong, distinct concept of identity. Many people from there would even consider themselves more Yorkshire than English, say. And Thank Goodness You're Here really plays into this idea. I've lived in Scotland for a very long time now, but I was actually born and raised in Yorkshire, and consequently, having more of an insider view than most people, I can definitely say that this does the county real justice, shows it real love, and it is almost without doubt the funniest game I've ever played in my life. It's basically a 2-button game and only takes a few hours to finish, but I genuinely laughed out loud more times in those few hours than for any media I can remember experiencing in the last decade, at least. It isn't that you need to have grown up entrenched in Yorkshire or wider British culture to understand and appreciate this game, or even find it funny, but it would help. It's almost like this is the opposite of the Yakuza situation I mentioned earlier, just this time I'm one of the people in the know. Nevertheless, I think the team at Cole Supper managed to tread the line between too esoteric and too generalized really well, so I would absolutely expect anyone to have a genuinely fun time with this. As the game goes on, everything just starts getting zanier and zanier, more and more absurd, and I would honestly be bewildered to see anyone playing this game without a massive smile plastered on their face. It's a real treat. At number 6, it's Animal Well. I've never been able to figure out what the reason is exactly, but I don't really like Metroidvanias very much. Something about them just doesn't really stick with me, even if I have fun playing one. I normally find it very easy to put down, and even easier to never pick up again. Animal Well, however, turned out to be my exception to this rule. I was initially skeptical, but I ended up being entranced by this game from the start, and it didn't really let go at all until I got the Platinum Trophy, so I guess that's one way I can sell it to you. I mean, if I'm anything to go by, you don't even have to like the genre to enjoy the game, so imagine how much you'd probably enjoy it if you were a big Metroidvania fan. Animal Well is super simple in concept, but one of those really cool experiences where you progress and realize that there is a lot of complexity propping up each instance of simplicity. The basic movements of the game are accessible and intuitive to grasp, and the items you find throughout to help traversal seem easy enough to use shortly after getting them, but there has been so much thought and effort put into every aspect of the game, meaning that the level design and movement have been perfectly tuned, and there are multiple ways of using each item in a way you won't have thought of when you first received it, meaning that your exponential growth through the game feels incredibly organic as you start to grasp the nuance of what you have at your fingertips. I mean, if you combine this really satisfying and consummately formulated gameplay with stunning audio-visual design and a painstakingly crafted map replete with secrets to discover, you have a winner by any metric. This is a properly good game. even if I hate being chased by that shitty ghost dog. At number 5, we have The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. This is the first main series Zelda game with the eponymous princess as our primary playable character. And if this one is anything to go by, let's hope they keep making these, because this is arguably the most fun I've had with a Zelda game in over a decade. The fundamental idea here is that instead of having that usual permanent access to a sword and shield, you're initially equipped with the ability to copy certain things you encounter in the game, from tables to beds to enemies, which you can then paste whenever you want to progress through the world and story. There are a lot of items and enemies you can clone, and these echoes are the building blocks of the whole game. Everything from battle to traversal is facilitated by them. But what makes it stand out for me is that it basically turns the entire experience into a giant puzzle, with the unique selling point that almost any challenge you face can be dealt with in a number of different ways. There are a lot of possibilities when it comes to clearing rooms and dungeons, reaching chests, attacking enemies, climbing, traversing the land quicker than you should be able to. And it's a real joy to look at what you have available and figure out then and there which of your 100+ echoes you need for that specific situation. Obviously, complete balance in a game like this would be essentially impossible. There will be certain echoes you almost never use and some you use all the time, but thanks to that classic, carefully thought through Zelda design philosophy, you're given the opportunity to solve each puzzle you come across your own way. And even if you rely on the same few echoes over and over again, it still feels great every single time. It's a perfect blend of accessible for new Zelda players and satisfying for experienced ones. I would really recommend it to anyone and everyone. Number 4 on our list here is, of course, Balatro. This is a deck-building, poker-adjacent roguelike. If you love deck builders, poker, or roguelikes, you will love this game. The crazy thing is, if you don't like deck builders, know fuck all about poker, and hate roguelikes, I reckon you'll still really like this game. I don't quite know how he did it, but Local Thunk, the one guy who developed Balatro, has basically achieved the impossible in making a super specific, hyper-focused game that appears to be inscrutable when you first see it. But in actuality, it's one of the most accessible, fun, and engaging games of the year. It definitely fits into that easy to learn, hard to master category. The basic idea is that you have a deck of cards, a few turns, and your job is to play poker hands. The game tells you what they all are for a quick refresher if you need it, and each hand you choose gives you a different amount of points. So you play one, and these super satisfying sound effects ring out as it runs through your cards, and if you got enough points during your turns, you'll move on to the next round. Pretty simple. Like all good roguelikes though, the uniqueness of every run is what makes Balatro shine. There are 150 Joker cards you can obtain, which act as modifiers for the run, possibly multiplying your score, re-triggering played cards, letting you duplicate or even permanently discard a card from your deck. There are also ways to upgrade both the cards in your deck and the points received from specific hands you play. There are 15 different decks to choose from, each providing a distinct and exclusive experience compared to the last. There are 8 difficulties to work through, with each new one adding yet more features to the game for you to contend with. I mean, it might sound overwhelming, but honestly, play this game for 3 or 4 runs, and I promise that at some point it will click for you. And that feeling of being overwhelmed will quickly be replaced by excitement. Aside from Final Fantasy XIV, which is literally an MMO designed to be played pretty much indefinitely, this is the game I've played the most this year. And I have a strong suspicion I'll be playing it this time next year too. How can you resist when number go up, you know? At number 3, Persona 3 Reload. This one stands apart from all the other entries because I've finished earlier iterations of Persona 3 like 4 different times. And I already know I love this game, whereas all other spots on this list are taken up by games I was going into pretty much blind. I'm a typical Persona fan, in the sense that I've played 3, 4, and 5 multiple times, and not 1 or 2. But of those latter 3 games, Persona 3 would probably be my favourite. And I found Reload to be, fairly comfortably, the best version of it that I've played. The most obvious improvement is aesthetic in nature. With the complete graphical overhaul merged with that more Persona 5 style UI, it's just crazy how good this game looks now. It's also a much more forgiving experience than any previous version, with countless quality of life changes to be found, most notably in a pseudo limit break system now available during battles, and in modifications made to dungeon crawling to make it easier to keep going for longer. That being said, I've seen people complain about how the change in graphics and ease of access has led to less consistent narrative theming at some points during the game, where the lack of that PS2 griminess or darkness and removal of some gameplay mechanics like fatigue and social link reversal can somewhat impede the efficiency with which the game deals with its heavy themes. And honestly, there's a fair point to be made there in favour of some of the previous entries, but it didn't actually bother me at all, personally. There are so many improvements to be found in Reload, and almost all of them make the game a more engaging and enjoyable player experience. So I would still stand by the idea that this is the definitive way to play Persona 3 now. The characters and story and music in this game are the best the series has to offer, in my opinion. And it also has my take for the best Persona social link. But how I would really sell it to you, without spoiling anything, is that the ending to Persona 3 is one of my all-time favourites. I really think everyone should experience it at some point, and this game is my pick for the best way to do that. In second place, we have Astrobot. Even though I really enjoyed Astro's Playroom when I first got the PS5, I was still suspicious of the rave reviews this game was getting a few months ago. It reached a point where you were hearing people talk about how this wasn't just a great PS5 3D platformer, but potentially PlayStation's greatest ever, even on par with some of the 3D Mario games, which tend to stand in a league of their own in this genre. But after finishing just a few of the levels in Astrobot, maybe an hour or 2 of playing, I had completely forgone any skepticism I was holding on to, and was fully converted to an evangelizing adherent of the Astrobot gospel. This is, alongside the Super Mario Galaxy games, the best 3D platformer I have ever played. It is sickeningly good. What I find most interesting is that the game's most obvious selling point, that being its celebration of the PlayStation brand, with all its references and cameos, plays virtually no role in how good it is. It's a fun component of the game, and you get some specific levels and upgrades based on games from the console's history, which are very cool. But if none of that sort of thing existed, and the game's theming was totally different, this would still be the cream of the crop, because the actual level design, tight controls, inventive power-ups, they're all pretty much as good as they could possibly be. The game's core, its skeleton, what everything else is built upon, is phenomenal, almost without flaws. The only complaint I would have about how it plays is that some of the power-ups get a bit less time to shine than others, and it would have been great to have more levels to explore some of these. It is funny though, because you know it's been a fantastic experience when your only real complaint is that you wanted more of a certain element rather than less of it. There's a good chance that in a different year, this could have snuck its way into first place. But unfortunately, this year, that is not possible. Because the game that takes the #1 spot in this list is, of course, Metaphor ReFantazio. Of every placement in this ranking, this is the one that required the least consideration on my part. Not only was this comfortably my favourite game that was released this year, it's knocking on the door to get into my top 5 games of all time. Metaphor is a JRPG published and developed by Atlus, and it shows. It borrows the framework of Persona's social links and confidants and its calendar gameplay loop, as well as integrating components of Shin Megami Tensei's press-turn battle system and so on. But despite being comprised of the building blocks of other Atlus games, at no point did Metaphor ever feel derivative to me. Instead, it felt like those other elements had finally been fully realized. I think this is because of how well these aforementioned building blocks blend with what Metaphor brings to the table itself, that being archetypes, which are essentially this game's take on a classic job system. Social connections in Metaphor are inextricably linked to the job system, and consequently the gameplay, but in a more balanced and well-integrated way than you'd find in any of the Persona games, which ultimately leads to every action in this game feeling worthwhile, because each choice you make is serving a real purpose, contributing in a seriously visible and tangible way to other ostensibly unrelated parts of your gameplay experience. I always really deliberated between my options when I had free time, and pretty much always felt like I'd got something really valuable out of it. Of course, this isn't just because of how wonderful the gameplay is alone. The writing in this game is really excellent, with equal attention paid to the dramatic denouement of the main narrative and throwaway NPC speech bubble dialogue as you're running past someone in a hub city. And given the topics the game wants to cover, it all needs to be good, and it really is. As so often happens with games in this genre, Metaphor deals with comically huge ideas. The story is based around the fallout of regicide, the death of a king with no heir, and how a fragmented and unequal society, mired with class issues and racism, can unite to collectively vote on who deserves to fill that royal void. It can be a very grim experience at points. Most examples I could give would be spoilers, but if you've played it, I'm sure you get what I'm saying. Despite that though, at no point does Metaphor ever fully submerge itself in a mire of despair. The staunch belief that a better world is possible and worth striving for against all odds is woven so deeply into the fabric of this game that it genuinely begins to affect you outside of the game. There's a distinct lack of cynicism in how Metaphor handles these serious issues, and I think it's actually genuinely hard to write something about idealism without cynicism, and for that story to never once feel like it lacks nuance or caveats or external perspectives. The needle was threaded so cleanly in this game, it's just astounding. Everything in Metaphor just made me feel like it was one of those transcendental gaming experiences you only get once in a blue moon. I haven't even spoken about how gorgeous the game is, how unforgettable the music is, how it has one of the all-time great video game parties, how it has one of the best JRPG villains ever. It's one of those games where you could go on forever about how good it was. But the main thing I'd want to leave you with is that this is one of those games that would do you a lot of good if you needed that, if you get what I mean. When I finished this game, I definitely wasn't exactly the same person I was when I started it, and I really hope that you play this and get something important and meaningful out of it as well. After all, isn't that why we're all here in the first place? And yeah, I guess that's it. That's the list. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you're still here, I imagine you're wanting a wee update on what's been going on, and you'll get that right now. You might already know if you follow me on other social media, or Patreon, or read the YouTube community posts I make sometimes, or even if you watched my Haiku video, but I have a chronic illness, a spinal disease, called syringomyelia. I've had it for a very, very long time, but the condition does often worsen as time goes on, and the last year and a half in particular have been very challenging health-wise. To be blunt, I've been very unwell for almost all of this time, and I've found it very difficult to do work to make videos because the kind of videos I usually make require a lot of time and effort and research and focus. And I've lacked focus in particular over the last 18 months, mostly on account of serious chronic pain. That's partly why I made this video, something a bit easier and more accessible, that also shows all of you that I am still alive and trying to make videos. I mean, you can see here some evidence of what I've been trying to do for the last year, which is make meaningful progress on a big Final Fantasy V analysis video to try and continue that series. But things just haven't been that simple, unfortunately. I have a bad habit of underselling how unwell I actually am, which is something I'm sure anyone listening who has a chronic illness will understand all too well. So I'm just trying to be as honest as possible here without coming across like I'm complaining or making excuses. But the basics are that I wake up every day hoping to make tangible progress on videos for this channel, and it just isn't always possible. Despite that, I do have my fingers crossed for 2025. We've got the Final Fantasy V video in the works. I'd also love to make a sequel to the big Hades video when Hades 2 fully releases. It would be great to get back into streaming as well, but I've just got to hope for a good run of form. If you have any questions about my health situation or plans for the channel and want further clarification or anything like that, feel free to ask below, and as long as you ask nicely, I'll do my best to respond to any queries you have. I guess that's mostly it for updates though. The only other thing before I go is to advertise my Patreon and thank everyone who's signed up. At the moment, it's a bit of a thankless job being a patron, considering how inactive I've been here over the last year. But knowing that, if you're still interested in helping me and the channel out, please take a look, it's linked in the description. And of course, as always, I'd like to give a special shout out to my highest tier patrons. Ali Cat, Christopher Oliver, Demi Rose 41, Genetic Jen, Humphrey Wallace, Hyungjin Song, Jack Powell, Leon, Moganori, Mr. Kef, Nankyoko, Nico, Omilas, Paul De Silva, Sam Nyland, Spumpus, and Wesley Dudley. I'm incredibly grateful that you've stuck around and helped me this year, even though you didn't get much in return. Hopefully we can make it more worth your while soon. One final thing, actually, because I know there will be comments. I have not played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth yet, and that is why it is not on the list. The chances are that if you're not happy that I didn't include something, I just didn't play it. I would still like to know your thoughts about my list though, if you've played the games or not, what would have been your #1 game, whatever you fancy. Thank you again for watching all this way, and I hope you all have a lovely new year, and fingers crossed, see you soon for another video. Cheers.